Chapter 5 Everybody's War. The American Civil War was not quite like any war that had ever happened before. Half a nation fought against the other half over the freedom of a small minority. This itself was something new. It was as new and as unpredictable as everything else in America. It left over 600,000 people dead. More Americans died in it than in any other war in all American history. In fact, more people died in the American Civil War than in any other war in the entire world during the 1800s. Of every 10 men who fought, 4 became casualties. No other modern nation paid such a high price to hold itself together. Southerners did not see themselves simply as slave owners fighting to preserve their property or as rebels trying to tear the Union apart. Instead, they viewed themselves as fighting the American Revolution all over again. White Southerners, as they said, were oppressed by Yankee tyrants. Men of the South were now playing the role of the gallant American colonists. Northerners were the oppressive British, and Abraham Lincoln was another George III. If the British government had no right to force American colonists to stay inside their empire, why did the United States government have any right to force Southern states to stay inside the Union? Southerners said they were fighting for self-government. Of course, this argument left out the whole question of slavery. They said they were fighting for self-government, but for whom and by whom? In 1860, there were nearly 4 million slaves in the southern states, while Southerners who said they were fighting for their own right to govern themselves were also fighting against the right of blacks to govern themselves. Fitzhugh, Calhoun, and other defenders of slavery had not seen it quite that way. The black man, they said, had no right to govern himself. Self-government was for white people only. When Southerners said that all they wanted was to secede from the Union, they also gave themselves a military advantage. To win their point, all they had to do was to declare their independence and to go their own way. On the other hand, the North would have to force the Southern states to obey the Union. The North would have to invade the South, occupy it, and subjugate it. The North had to attack. At the beginning, many Northerners figured the war would be over quickly. They optimistically referred to it as the 6 months war. But the optimists were wrong. Instead of 6 months, the war lasted 4 blood-soaked years. This new warfare would be as different from earlier American wars as an elephant is from a mosquito. There were reasons for the North to be optimistic. The North seemed stronger in every way. Also, military leaders believed that armies on the attack always had a great advantage. The textbooks the generals had studied when they were cadets at West Point explained that the way to win a war is to concentrate your efforts on 1 or 2 points and attack. The defenders will be weaker because they have to spread out their forces to protect against assaults at any number of potential locations. Moreover, said the textbooks, in a concentrated assault, defenders can't shoot fast enough. Most of the attacking force can get through before defenders can hit them. Therefore, the generals thought if the North could only keep the advantage of the attack, they could win a few decisive battles, capture the enemy capital, and the war would be over. But the textbooks the Civil War generals had read at West Point had been written based on insights from the age of smooth-bore flintlock muskets. By the time of the Civil War, smooth-bore flintlocks were seriously outdated technology. Smooth-bore flintlocks did indeed put defenders at a great disadvantage. They were hard to aim, they had a short range, and they were notoriously slow to reload. So all of the things the textbooks said made sense if you were fighting with smooth-bore flintlocks. But as we have seen, during the American Revolution, many American backwoodsmen had begun using rifles. The rifle was just coming into regular use when the Civil War began, and the rifle became the standard American Army weapon during the war. What makes a rifle a rifle? Rifles received their name from the fact that the insides of their barrels are rifled, cut with spiral grooves. When you fire a bullet out of such a barrel, the rifle sets it spinning, and the spin gives it a longer range, in the mid-1800s, 500 yards instead of 50 yards. And the spin also gives these guns a much more accurate aim. Besides rifling, the modern rifles of the Civil War used caplocks instead of flintlocks. The old flintlock gun struck a piece of flint against steel. This made a spark that in turn ignited gunpowder that shot the bullet. Flintlocks could not work in wet weather. Caplocks, however, used a chemical fulminate of mercury to make the explosion that shot the bullet, and the fulminate of mercury itself was covered by a metal cap that protected it from the weather. You could fire a caplock reliably, even in the midst of rain. Finally, the old muskets had been muzzle loaders. You had to push the gunpowder and bullet down the barrel from its mouth. The new rifles, however, were breech loaders. That meant they loaded from the back near the trigger. And that, of course, was much more convenient and quicker. Some rifles even had automatic loading systems. They would load many rounds in succession from a single clip. These new weapons gave great advantages to the defenders, but the generals didn't realize it at the beginning of the war. Indeed, it took them several years to alter their tactics based on a new understanding of the relative advantages enjoyed by attackers and defenders. In the old-fashioned war, a soldier carried all the ammunition he could use in a battle. The old muskets were so slow to load that it took some time before he could use up his ammunition. But with the fast-loading new rifles, a soldier could not keep shooting very long unless someone brought him new supplies. This made some troublesome problems, especially for generals on the attack. To move ammunition became as important as to move men. Meanwhile, the defenders had all the ammunition they required sitting beside them, and with their accurate long-range rifles, they sat protected behind battlements. Now they could pick off the attackers before even these even came close. They could fire quickly again and again, but the attacking force was on the move. If they stopped to reload, they were sitting ducks. It took time for the generals to learn how the rules of war had changed. It took time before they realized that everybody had to take cover. Attackers had to spread out into small parties of skirmishers to make more dispersed targets. It took time before the Indian tactics, which Americans had tried against the British in the Revolution, became the norm. It took time before attacking soldiers began to make instant fortifications of logs, bales of hay, rocks, anything in sight, so they could pile their ammunition beside them and get some of the advantages of defenders. Most important, it took time for the generals and soldiers to learn to make the earth itself into a fort by using spades. This was the beginning of modern trench warfare. In the old days, generals thought it was cowardly for a soldier to hide in a hole in the ground. But now, soldiers had no choice. General Robert E. Lee ordered his men in the Army of Northern Virginia to work hard at digging trenches. At first, they laughed at him. They called him their King of Spades. But they soon thanked him for giving them protection against enemy rifles. The axe and the spade were now as important as the gun. One man in a hole with an artillery battery behind him was worth 3 men in the open. The attacking army then had to carry enormous supplies of ammunition, and they had to build their own fortifications as they advanced. No one had used railroads much in wars before, but now they were of great help in carrying supplies, especially the heavy ammunition. But once the supplies left the rails, they still had to be carried by horse or mule over bumpy roads and through mud. In this kind of warfare, railroads were lifelines. They were slow and hard to build. They were also quick and easy to cut. If you could cut the enemy's rails, he would eventually have to stop shooting. The Civil War, therefore, became more and more a war aimed at the enemy's communication lines. The First Battle of Bull Run, July 1861, was still very much like the old-fashioned warfare, with solid lines of soldiers standing up against each other to fight a decisive battle. By the time of the Battle of Petersburg, 3 years later, the Union Army was aiming at the Confederate railroads. The new kind of warfare was a war of exhaustion. It was not enough for an army to cut off their enemy's supplies by railroad. They also had to prevent the enemy from bringing supplies in by water. The South, as we have seen, was blessed with many rivers. At first, it seemed that the Mississippi would be a God-given supply line behind the whole South. But early in the war, the Union Army dashed this hope on the part of the Confederates. David Glasgow Farragut astonished the South when he captured New Orleans for the Union. Farragut was the son of a naval officer. He began his studies to become a naval officer himself at the age of 9. He saw action in the War of 1812 when he was only 11. Now he was some 50 years. It was some 50 years later. Farragut's orders commanded him to capture two forts that protected New Orleans at the mouth of the Mississippi. But he disregarded orders and seized New Orleans itself by racing past the two forts. In doing so, he lost only 3 of his 17 ships. Farragut entered the city on April 25, 1862, almost before anyone knew he was in the neighborhood. After waiting for an official surrender that never came, on April 29th he ordered his men to raise the U.S. flag over the Customs House and City Hall. New Orleans was under Union control. Now the South could not bring in supplies for its troops in the West from the Gulf of Mexico. The ocean and the Gulf of Mexico surrounded the southern states. With several other good ports beside New Orleans, the South still had highways to the world. The North therefore had to block up the other southern ports if they were to strangle the South. The South did wonders with its few ships by shielding them with iron and equipping them with steam-driven propellers. These had advantages against old wooden sailing vessels. It was a story very similar to the new firearms against the old. The new ironclad ships gave a great new advantage to the defense. Still, there were so many northern ships offshore that they harassed merchant vessels and kept them from reaching southern ports. The war of exhaustion hit everybody in the South, civilians as well as military. The same ships that would have brought arms and ammunition to the armies also would have brought machinery for the factories and food, clothing, and medical supplies for all. The northern blockade against the South worked slowly, but it worked surely. People called it the conda, after the anaconda, the huge boa constrictor snake that kills its prey by squeezing. The war of exhaustion was slow. The North did not win it by a few knockout blows like Napoleon's defeat at the Battle of Waterloo. Rather, they won it by depriving and starving the South. As the struggle dragged on into its 4th year, European experts who had never seen this kind of war before began to think it was not war at all. One Prussian general sneered that he would not even study the battles of the war because they were nothing but the combats of 2 armed mobs. Another old world critic compared the North and South to 2 lunatics playing chess. Both knew a few moves, but neither understood the game. But this kind of war was not a game. The old rules of war that the generals had learned at West Point were no longer of much use. It was everybody's war, with no holds barred. The winning generals turned out to be those like Ulysses Simpson Grant, who had never believed the old rules, or those like William T. Sherman, who were good at forgetting the rules. The long war was enough to try anybody's patience. The northern generals devised shortcuts. Of course, you could exhaust your enemy by cutting off his supplies, by wearing him down in one place after another. And that was Lincoln's large strategy. He wanted to surround the South and to cut it off from the world and the world's supplies. That way, the South eventually could not live. You could exhaust your enemy, too, simply by destroying him, by burning his crops and houses and destroying his factories, by tearing up his railroads and blowing up his bridges. Impatient northern generals tried precisely this. On May 7, 1864, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman set out southeastward from Chattanooga, Tennessee, on a march of destruction. Going through Georgia, his army traveled light. He told his men to carry only their arms. He figured that they would loot food and supplies along the way. This, too, would help exhaust the enemy, but it also solved the problem of supply. Sherman ordered his troops to move fast, without waiting to protect their rear. His army left a path of devastation 300 miles wide all across Georgia. What was not worth carrying away, they burned. What they could not burn, they smashed. Later, General Sherman explained that what many people called humanity had no place in modern war. In the end, so his argument went, the only way to be humane, to get the war over, was to be cruel. The Confederate General Lee had warned his men that they should never hurt civilians, but Sherman argued you could not win that way. Northerner Philip H. Sheridan was so successful in battle that he was named a general when he was barely 30 years old. Sheridan claimed that the only up-to-date strategy in war was to punish every enemy, man, woman, and child. Leave them nothing but their eyes to weep with. That was the new path to victory in the new kind of warfare. It took 4 full years to exhaust the South. If the North had not been so much the stronger, it might have taken much longer. With 23 states against the South's 11, with 22 million people against the South's 9 million, the North had a big advantage. The North had more and better railroads, more ships, and more factories. Also, while the North had many labor-saving devices, like the reaper, to free men for the army, the South depended for its labor on black slaves. These might at any moment turn out to be a fifth column, an enemy force behind Southern lines, because they had very good reasons of their own to help the enemy. Every third Southerner was black. Southerners therefore lived in fear of a civil war all of their own if their slaves ever decided to take up arms. Meanwhile, the North decided in December 1862 to accept blacks in its armed forces. When it did, more than 180,000 black men joined their ranks. The North grew many different crops that it could consume. The South, however, was gutted with just a few staples: tobacco, cotton, and rice. These staples could not sustain them. The South had to export these crops in order to obtain anything else. Worst of all, the South suffered from delusions that prevented her from seeing facts. Southerners were astonished that any power on earth dared make war on the world's greatest producer of cotton. They had long told themselves cotton was king. They imagined, too, that only Southerners were civilized, and that one Southerner could whip a half-dozen Yankees and not half try. The South's grand dreams turned into nightmares for everyone. In the North, too, however, it was everybody's war. There, too, nearly every family lost a soldier, and in quite new ways the gore came into everyone's home. For the first time in history, correspondents telegraphed eyewitness accounts of the battles back to their newspapers. Civilians were able to read about the horrors every morning at breakfast. The New York Herald once had 40 correspondents in the field and spent $500,000 on them. Northern correspondents who would have been shot as spies if discovered smuggled themselves behind Southern lines, disguised as women or Confederate soldiers. When Albert D. Richardson of the New York Tribune traveled through the South in 1861, he sent back his dispatches through a New York bank in code. General Sherman was so irritated at the crowd of correspondents around his headquarters that he threatened to shoot them. General Grant was more amiable and used the correspondence to give people the news he wanted them to believe. When some generals objected that the newspapers were giving away valuable information to the enemy, the New York World protested that this was a people's war. The pioneer photographer Matthew Brady and his large crew, at the risk of their lives, sent photographs back home to show everyone the battle action. Soldiers sometimes ran away from Brady's camera because they had never seen a camera before. They imagined it might be a new kind of gun. Soldiers called Brady's photographic buggy the "What is it?" and served as a conspicuous target. On several occasions, Brady barely escaped being killed. After the first battle of Bull Run, Brady was lost for 3 days before finding his way back to Washington. He quickly secured new equipment there and rushed back to the battlefield. In the People's War, women played a new important part. Dorothea Dix, the courageous New Englander who had braved public opinion to prevent cruelties to the insane, now followed the example of the Englishwoman Florence Nightingale. Miss Dix became the first superintendent of Army nurses. She was a strict manager and enlisted only women who were strong and not too good-looking. In those days, it took gumption to find any place for women in the Army, and she was the pioneer. Some women were so anxious to do their part in the war that besides nursing, at least 400 of them pretended to be male soldiers. Although it was everybody's war, the leaders did much to turn the tide. There is good reason to ask, would the North still have won if Jefferson Davis had been President of the United States and Lincoln had been President of the Confederacy? Lincoln was a stronger leader. As a politician, he knew how important it was in everybody's war to keep everybody's support. In late 1862, when the war was going badly for the North, he felt the time had come to show a great moral purpose for the war. He also wanted to try to secure foreign support. So on January 1st, 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that all slaves were free. In the United States, they that were rebelling against the United States Slaves in the slave states that had stuck with the Union, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, weren't freed for another 2 or 3 years. Maryland slaves in November of 1864, Missouri's in January 1865, and the slaves in Kentucky and Delaware not until December 18, 1865, when the 13th Amendment was proclaimed. Just as the Declaration of Independence had helped unite the colonists and helped persuade France to support them in their fight against Britain, so the Emancipation Proclamation did its work. Mr. Lincoln's cause, wrote an English merchant on hearing of the proclamation, "It's just and holy, the cause of truth and of universal humanity." English workingmen held mass meetings to support the Union. Now there was little danger that the British government would recognize or support the Confederacy. This was no longer merely a war for Union, but a war against slavery. Lincoln was not afraid of new ideas. He tried one general after another until he found Ulysses Simpson Grant. Of course, it was partly Lincoln's good luck that Grant happened to be there, but Lincoln was willing to try his luck on a general who usually looked a mess and did not insist on waging war according to the textbooks he had studied at West Point. Lincoln believed that a new world needed new ideas. General Grant agreed. He had a notion of how warfare had changed, and he had the advantage on the battlefield that he was a hard man to predict. After General Sherman's march of devastation through Georgia and the Carolinas, the South was still not quite defeated, but she was exhausted. She had no strength to go on. Then at last, when Union soldiers cut the railroad to the Confederate capital of Richmond, the Confederate government abandoned Richmond. In a final battle at Appomattox, General Grant overwhelmed Lee's force. On the afternoon of April 9, 1865, the Confederate General Lee, accompanied only by his military secretary, rode his horse to a little white house in the town of Appomattox Courthouse on the Appomattox River in central Virginia. He went to arrange his surrender, and one of the most remarkable and most encouraging episodes in American history occurred there. It showed that despite the monstrous indecencies of war, Americans on opposite sides of the battle could still respect one another. Grant, who had just come in from the field, was dusty and even more unkempt than usual. Confronting him in the living room of the house he had taken for his headquarters was General Lee, handsome, erect, in a spotless uniform and wearing his dress sword. The men sat down and then exchanged recollections of their fighting together 20 years before the Mexican War. The two great generals talked to each other with calmness, courtesy, and respect. Now that the fighting was over, it seemed that humanity had suddenly returned. Lee heard Grant's terms of surrender. Grant was more generous than he needed to be. He allowed Southern officers to keep their swords, the symbols of their honor, and he allowed officers and men to keep their horses so they could go home and plant their crops. Lee was touched. "This," he said, "will have a very happy effect upon my army." A renewed nation fused in the fires of war would now seek its destiny in peace.